All right, welcome again to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast for anyone who's wondering whether they can trust that new study they heard about in the news. I'm Matt Fox, professor of epidemiology and global health, and I'm here with Chris Gill and Don Thea, both in the Department of Global Health. Before we get started, we want to take a second to remind you about the Population Health Exchange, Boston University School of Public Health's research hub for lifelong learning. Find out more at www.pophealthex.org, where you'll find this podcast as well as many other population health learning tools. Today in our first segment, our Journal Club segment, we are going to jump into a paper that looks at whether or not watching sports, hockey specifically, can lead to heart problems. In the second part of the podcast, our deep dive segment, we're going to talk about the role of sample size in judging whether or not we believe a study's results. And then in our third segment, our amazing and amusing, we'll try to crack each other up, or Chris will tell us something about bats or platypuses or fungi.
Some critter.
Who knows? By the way, my spell checker says that platypuses is the plural. I checked it out.
That is correct.
According to
That is correct.
And then just a reminder, we are available now on iTunes and all your major podcast sites. Search for Pre-Associations Podcast, not just Free Associations. And also, we strongly encourage you to rate us on your podcast app. It really helps people find us, and then it won't just be me rating us.
Can I make the obvious point?
That always do.
If they're listening to it, they have already found it.
Yeah, well.
So they don't need to be told.
Well, tell all your friends. All right. There you go. So once again, Chris points out the obvious.
Sorry.
All right. So in segment one, we're going to jump right into it. We are looking at a study that seems to suggest that watching hockey can increase your heart rate, possibly enough to lead to negative heart outcomes. The article was published in the, wait for it here, Canadian Journal of Cardiology, not the Canadian Journal of Hockey Cardiology, which is another one. And the lead author is Leah T. Carey, and it's titled Heart Rate Response in Spectators of the Montreal Canadiens Hockey Team. I do want to point out that this study was done by looking at people who are watching the Montreal Canadiens. So as a Boston Bruins fan, I'm already
biased against it.
And let me give you some of the headlines, because the reason we're taking this one on is because it got a lot of press. So first one's Science Daily says, how much can watching hockey stress your heart? Time magazine says, is watching sports bad for your health? Here's what new research says. The New York Daily News, always to be trusted, says, watching hockey could double your heart rate, but it won't replace your workout. And MSN says, just watching hockey raises your heart rate. A study. And my favorite, CTV News, heart-stopping NHL hockey, a health risk for cardiac patients. Heart-stopping.
Wow.
Yeah.
That would be a cardiac risk.
A lot to chew on here. So Don, can you start us off?
Missed that part of the paper.
Yeah, I know. Don, you're going to start us off by telling us. I have to admit, I feel a little bit with this study like we're having our dessert for dinner here. This feels to me like we're getting into the amazing and amusing.
Science immediately.
But break it down for us, and in particular, explain to us whether this is in fact one of your ignoble studies or this is a real study.
No, this is a real study. This is a real study published in a real journal, and I'm sure it's a study that is close to the hearts of many Canadians because it's about hockey.
Hearts?
In the introduction, they give us some background information on how important hockey is
Obviously.
in Canada. I didn't realize that on May 12th, 1994, ice hockey was recognized and declared by law to be Canada's national winter sport, and that there are 2,500 hockey rinks.
You were just
in
ignorant
Canada.
if you didn't know that.
And in any event, the stated reason for why these authors decided to do this study was that there has been an observation in the past that during times of very fraught sports competitions, the number of heart attacks have gone up. And so it's not a crazy notion that, in fact, excitement associated with a sporting event could be associated with untoward cardiac events. So what they did was that they did a study where they asked the question, is the heart rate increased among fans of the Canadian, the Montreal Canadiens?
We're in last place right now, I believe.
I have no idea. I don't follow hockey.
Last place, I believe.
But what they did is they identified 20 individuals who were
20. Huge study.
18 years of age or older. And they divided them up into two groups. One group would watch a hockey game, the Montreal Canadiens, live at the stadium. and the other group watched it in front of television. And they were the Holter monitors were put on all of the individuals, and they basically just measured the heart rate as they were watching the game. And the long and the short of it is that the heart rate was elevated in all of the participants, and the heart rate was elevated more in the participants who were watching the hockey game live. I mean, is that not something that you would think is completely self-evident? The one thing that they didn't do,
Having been to a hockey game, I could say yes.
You would think so.
Yep.
You know, the one thing that they didn't do is they didn't say whether they were watching the same game. So it's entirely possible that the game that the people at home were watching were duds of games. As opposed to the one at the stadium, they probably were all sitting together watching the same game, and might have been a really exciting game.
Oh, plus you could have been on the kiss cam. You could have had the t-shirt cannon being shot at you.
Yeah.
There's so much going on.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not just
being
the
hit with a
hockey
bag
action.
of peanuts or
Yeah.
beer being
That a
poured
fight
all
breaks
over you
out
from
in
the
front
guy
of
above you in the balcony.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there's also the famous chicken.
Sorry, what now?
The guy in the chicken suit.
Okay, you're thinking of baseball from
sorry.
the 1980s.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
The one thing about this
You
study
may not have figured out by
it a
now that
penguin?
Chris is not the biggest sports fan, I think.
Oh, no, I love sports.
Yeah. Go sports.
Yeah, go sports. I'm a sports.
The one thing that I really liked about
fan
this study
guy.
was that when they measured the heart rate for the people who were at the stadium, they equated that elevated heart rate with a state of vigorous exercise, which is understandable because they got up to like 30% above their resting heart rate. But they also, when they also measured the heart rate for the people sitting on their couch watching TV, the heart rate was elevated to a level that was somewhat equivalent to moderate exercise.
Yes.
The idea of being able to sit on your couch, watch sports, and then
get a
not
workout.
have to go to the gym.
No,
I
it's
love
just
it.
as
The
good.
implications are staggering. This is very profound and important research.
I think we should
I
not.
love this study.
Let's not dig any deeper.
I love this
Let's
study.
just declare victory and go home.
Right. So technically going to a bar every night is like a workout.
We haven't done that study yet.
But
we
that's,
haven't done
that's
that
where
study.
this is going.
That is definitely, I mean, obviously there are implications for future studies here. Chris?
Well,
Wait, there was
Oh,
one.
there's more.
Yeah,
There's
there's one more thing. One of the factors that they analyzed was something called fan passion, and they.
You gotta talk about the fan passion.
They
so
normalized
good.
the results
Normalized.
according to fan passion, and I did a fair amount of work trying to find this fan passion scale.
Wait. So this is like a scale to indicate how
Passionate you are
passionate you are about the Canadian.
about
Right.
sports,
Which to me is a reason not to talk to you. But anyway, go ahead.
But in any event, I tried to find what the scale was all about, and I couldn't find the actual scale. But there has been a scale that it was developed for the soccer population.
Yes.
And they have evaluated the relationship that a sports fan has to being a sports fan or to
rabidness.
to their team,
Yep.
and they basically score it according to whether they're extremely passionate sports fans or not. And they have some questions that indicate that the person is a passionate fan in a beneficial way, and some that are in a non-beneficial way.
Or like a hoodlum way.
Well, no, they asked the question:
Or like it's
would,
just- it's too upsetting
if
to
your
watch.
team were playing in the playoffs, would you leave work for that?
Yes.
Would you not take care of your child if your child needed to be taken care of?
I mean, I'm on a podcast.
Or-
I can't say that.
Yeah. So I thought that those particular comparisons were really very interesting. But apparently in this study,
Yep.
fan passion had no effect whatsoever
On your heart rate.
So if you were a very passionate fan, your heart rate would go up the same as if you were a so-so passionate fan.
More
But
of
they're
a
only
meh.
measuring one domain of fan passiondom, right? I mean, this could be a very subtle phenomenon that could express like in terms of your tendency to tip over cop cars and light them on fire after a victory by the Canadians against the dreaded Penguins.
They really ought to assess,
Which
so
did, by the
fan
way.
hooliganism is what they really should do.
Right. They need a bigger sample size.
Yeah.
Oh, well, let's get into it. Chris, what's your
20.
What's your take? What's
Magic
your take?
number is 20. That is a very
20.
small sample size. Yet, I'm entirely inclined to believe that the study
This is a tricky
is
one for that
fundamentally
reason.
correct.
It's tricky.
Probably correct. And they also had longitudinal data capture.
Well, how
on all
could it
these
not be
individuals.
correct?
So yeah, it was like, how could it not be true? The only question is like, why bother since it's so obviously true
That's
before you
the,
ever do a
that's
study?
the issue. That's the big issue.
Yeah.
I mean,
This harkens back to like, marijuana research, where I saw this published study, peer-reviewed published study, where
People who smoke marijuana
smoked
get
a lot
the
of,
munchies?
they gave a bunch of people marijuana and a bunch of people who they didn't give marijuana, and they had them do neuropsych tests on various cognitive, function scales, and the guys who smoked a lot of marijuana did poorly.
I thought you were going to say they just put Doritos out and saw who ate more.
Well, I think if they had been looking to see like, the beneficial effects of marijuana include like, treatment of of pizza deficiency syndrome or inadequate ice cream intake syndrome, they would find it's a very effective cure.
And they probably go together.
Good Lord.
So anyway, I mean, it's like, okay, so we have to be serious
Admit
here.
it.
Right?
Were you in that study?
We're going to be serious. No,
Okay.
I was not, but what the best study ever.
Yeah, I'll volunteer for that study.
Best study ever. Free Doritos.
Oh, man.
To all participants. So like, seriously, what are let's be mature about this.
Okay, us?
Us, we're going to
Got
be
it.
mature about this.
All
So
right.
That's going to be tough.
should, because I do think that the public health message here gets a little bit muddled. Because on the one
big
hand,
time.
we're saying, people ought to exercise moderately and maybe vigorously after a while and get their heart rates up. On the other hand, we're saying that getting your heart rate moderately or significantly elevated is bad. So which is it? Is good or bad? Like, where are we going with this? Should people's heart rates go up? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I don't know. What is this
I'm not
thing?
a doctor. You're asking me?
The heart's designed to go up and down. It does that. It has physiologic mechanisms that make it go up and down.
Sure.
In response to demand, right? And so what's the demand? So are we saying that couch potato elevations in the heart rate are bad, yet going for a vigorous run on your treadmill, that's good? I mean, which one is it? Yeah, I don't know. I personally think that heart rate elevations due to snow shoveling is bad.
Oh, I think
That should
we
be
could,
avoided
yeah,
at
I
all
think there's
costs.
no
Yeah.
question about that
Yeah,
one.
we know there's a lot of sudden death, heart attacks, and also
Sure.
squash, apparently. There's a lot of sudden death.
Squash
Yeah.
specifically.
Squash specifically.
Squash the sport, not
Apparently.
the
Yeah,
not the fruit.
correct.
Vegetable.
Not
Racquetball.
No.
honestly.
That's just clear confounder.
Yeah.
All right. So this 20 number does worry me a little bit.
Because it's small?
It's small. That's a tiny number. So we should say that this study is not without precedent. So there is a
literature?
There is a literature. So this was a 2008 study in the New England Journal of Medicine. So as good as it gets, that looked at cardiovascular events during World Cup soccer.
Right.
So now we're not talking about elevated heart rate. We're talking about cardiovascular events. Massive study that not massive, actually not, I take that back. It was 4,000 odd cardiovascular events that found that on days of matches involving the German team, this was done in Germany, involving the Germany team, the incidence of cardiac emergency was 2.66 times that during a control period, and so on and so forth. So there is reason to believe that sporting events and stressful events in general that elevate your heart rate can lead to heart attacks and other cardiovascular events, strokes, whatever. But that's different from what this study found, which, let's be clear, was a small study of 20 people
Of a single effect.
of a very small of an effect that isn't the same as a cardiac event. And so my worry about studies like this is, and part of the reason why I really wanted to talk about it is, despite the fact that I think obviously there's credibility, there's a bit of a so what factor, but more to the point, when you do studies like this, they're cheap and easy to do, right? All you got to do is have this ability to measure heart rate and presumably be able to fork out some money to buy tickets to the Canadians game, because I assume they actually bought the tickets, which bias right there. And so if it's cheap and easy to do, you could do this as a little project for a grad student, just go and measure 20 people. And then every time we find nothing, we're not going to publish that because it's a study of 20 people that no one's going to care that we didn't find anything. And then you wait for that one time in 20 or 100 or 1,000 that you find something and say, we got to publish this. Mm-hmm. And so the chances of these tiny little studies finding something that is totally meaningless strikes me as
Pretty great.
huge. It's pretty great.
Huge. Bigly.
Bigly.
No,
On the other hand, this one actually, I suppose, has some credibility to it. So it's it's a little hard to say what it means. I don't want to.
My question is, would this have gotten published in a journal other than the Canadian?
Yeah, it's a good question. I will ask if this study can be repeated in Pittsburgh for my sister and brother-in-law and my nieces, because I think they would want to know about the penguins. But there is no, as far as I know, there's no Pittsburgh Journal of Cardiology.
You know, I think the first line in the conclusions tells it all.
Oh, doesn't it?
About
This is
bias.
the best. This is great.
First line is, it is exciting to watch the Montreal Canadiens.
So good. It's so good.
Exclamation point.
Okay, wait a minute. So there are some other choice lines in here. There are two others. So you already got the one about all the details on hockey. So there's also some weird details in here. So they say all hockey games were digitally recorded on a high-definition terminal, Illico X8 from Vidderton, Montreal, Canada, and viewed to determine the timing of relevant events. Do we really need to know what kind of TV it was? And then they say the study exclusively involves spectators of one hockey team in a city with a strong fan base and emotional attachment to their team. As such, results might not be generalizable to spectators of all hockey teams. Moreover, the study was performed during regular season games and may not accurately reflect the intensity of heart rate responses during higher stakes postseason playoff series and championship games. Wow.
Wow. So who do the Canadians like? Who's their arch rival?
The Bruins. Why do you even have to ask
is it the
that?
Bruins? Is it the Bruins?
Remember, this
Not like
podcast
not
is
like the
being
Canucks or
recorded in
something?
Boston.
Wow.
Wow. Of course, but the Boston Bruins are the best, so they're very exciting to watch.
They really
They
are. Think
so
of all
good.
the heart attacks
And
during
the Patriots, they are excellent.
Oh, thank you for
excellent.
saying that, Chris. You're just
Thanks.
trying to butter me up.
One thing I thought,
last
like,
point to Chris.
You know, just like lost opportunities to really dig into this very rich data set. They
Oh,
have
yeah.
for their
Of 20
subjects.
people. Okay, before you even
But
say that.
see, like since we're on screen, you can actually see the figure
Yeah.
with the lines going up and down, indicating the heart rate over time. It's very exciting. But why did they not overlay like shots on goal and goals
Good.
on this figure?
Too
Like,
common.
does this spike here? Is that where they shot and missed, or when like there was a cheap shot foul and there was a fight? Well, like what was going on to make these things? Don't you want to know?
You also want to know whether they're watching the same game because you know those two curves do not really track the same way.
I also don't know what baseline heart rate and peak heart rate means. I don't get. I
Heart
have
rate
no idea
before
what
the
this means.
game and the heart rate during the game.
I have no idea.
Can
They
I
don't really
also
define
just
it.
make the last point that I want to make, which is they have included a pie chart in their paper.
Yeah,
And
I
I am
like
of
that.
the opinion there is never a need for a pie chart. Ever.
Oh, stop.
Unless you're trying to make a hockey puck. Which is exactly it's exactly what they're doing.
Notice that.
It's a hockey
I love
puck.
it. I love it.
Is
That
that
is
figure
so-
3.14?
It's Chris. All right, moving on, guys.
All right,
moving
I
on.
have for our next segment, I have a very appropriate study.
Okay, I got to do the lead-in.
All right, go ahead.
All right, so moving on to our second segment.
Are
So
we doing methodology?
no, we're doing sample size.
Sample
Yeah.
size. So sorry. Methodology. But second section is always methodology.
The second section is a deep dive, Chris. Honestly.
Like Acapulco.
Oh boy, what?
Those people who jump off the cliff.
Chris, have you
Love.
been to all these podcasts? I think
Chris,
he's missing
Go
some.
back to your Love Boat episodes. All right, so in our second segment, we are going to take up a topic that obviously comes out of this first one, which is how big is big enough when it comes to studies. So this study clearly had just a tiny sample size, 20 people. And in fact, whenever, as Don or Chris showed you, whenever you can plot all of the data in a figure in your paper, you have a small study, I would say. It's pretty likely. And yet there are also cases we can point to of very, very small studies that have, had very meaningful results that have led us down the paths to figuring out, the cause of HIV and things like that. So I don't want to totally denigrate small studies, but the question is, when is a small study something that we care about, and when is a small study something that we just dismiss outright? And, how big does a study need to be when you're reading for you to be able to say, I think the results are good enough? Chris, you're going to take that one on first. Apparently, he's going to wander away from the mic
Small studies.
as he does.
Okay.
Wanders away from the topic sometimes too.
Small studies. Well,
How big is big enough, Chris?
Okay. All right. I'll answer that question. I'm gonna give you the ultimate waffle, which means which is to say it depends. So it depends on like what you are expecting to see and how extraordinary the event is in context.
What do you mean by extraordinary?
Okay. So like, you remember post 9/11. There was this unfortunate news office worker in Boca Raton, Florida. Right? Is Boca Raton in Florida? Yeah, Boca Raton, Florida. Who died of anthrax.
Yep.
Okay. So, no, I remember the initial news reports about, in the Boston Globe, because I had the Globe at that time.
'Cause we're in Boston, as
that
we pointed out.
the FBI, saw no hint of foul play or that this was a bioterrorism event. And I was thinking to myself, gee, that really? Huh. That's funny, because I would have thought that would be like high on the list of reasons why people who work in an office in Boca Raton would get anthrax.
Okay,
Because
so
you
this
wouldn't think that this guy, like in his daily thing of doing National Enquirer news puff pieces, which was his job, is going to do anything that would in any way expose him to anthrax. And so the fact that he got anthrax is mighty suspicious. And of course, it turned out he got anthrax because he was mailed an envelope filled with anthrax spores. And so it was bioterrorism. And so there you have your N of one in experiment, where the event was so extreme and so unusual that even though there's no control, you have to say that cannot happen normally. And we should like hit all the alarm bells on that.
So really rare events.
So really rare events. So it's
pay more
true
attention
that
to smaller.
sometimes these events are salient and profound and telling.
And in fact, by definition, if it's a rare event, an extremely rare event, you're never going to have a big study. And that was, of course, part of the problem with the, trying to do an Ebola vaccine study during the Ebola outbreak is, okay, in the last one, there was probably enough people, but generally, when there's an Ebola outbreak, you're talking about 50 cases, 100 cases. There's not enough to be able to.
Well, they didn't have the vaccine until the very end of the epidemic.
Fair enough.
That
We're
was
trying to
a
figure
bigger problem.
Trying to figure out causes, things like that, or what's the.
You already alluded to the
good for
early
me.
cases of HIV in San Francisco and New York.
I did.
As being another example of where I don't remember the actual number, but it was a very small number of individuals, young male gay men, who had died of unusual opportunistic infections, and the doctors were appropriately calling the alarm bells and saying, "This does not compute. Something is going on here. This is new. Something is going on here. We need to think about."
But
this.
you could make the argument that that's a case series, and that's sort of a different animal than
as opposed to a control.
A controlled study. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So we want to put a control arm on this, and when big enough is enough.
Just saying, when do you dismiss small studies outright, or are there cases where you'd say, a small study can give us the definitive answer?
I think what you have to do is you have to do a power analysis. You have to really, in kind of a critical and rigorous way, go through the calculations that are necessary to tell you whether the size of your sample is sufficient to be able to discern a meaningful difference between the two groups.
Okay, so let me just explain this. So when you do a study, typically you have to do something called a sample size calculation, where based on what you expect to see in the study, you determine how many people you need to be in your study in order to be able to come up with what are referred to as statistically significant results, which aren't necessarily meaningful results, but that is the standard we go by. Some people refer to these as sample size manipulations because you are essentially trying to figure out what can I really afford,
right.
And so I'll just make the numbers look like what I can really afford to do, which
we all do.
Particularly in observational studies, I don't have any real problem with that. But we do these calculations to try and figure out how many people would I have to be in my study given what I reasonably expect to see, and this is kind of our guide. But the question is, if that guide says you only need to do a study of 20 people, are you okay with it?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think this is complicated. I mean, that is one approach.
One approach.
The statistical approach, the frequentist approach that you're describing, and I'm not going to go like a little Bayesian here. I'm not a Bayesian. I'm not a statistician, so I'm by definition not a Bayesian.
I'm a big fan of Bayes, but I'm not sure the podcast audience is.
Well, the Bayes people. This is going to be very hard to say. That the basic tenet is that your belief in something being true is conditional on information you have, and not just like the information you have, but how influential that information is. So let me give you an example that's very sort of intuitive. I live out in the country, the wilds of Lincoln, Massachusetts, and I'm driving down the road, and along comes a Model T Ford. And I go, oh, cool, a Model T Ford.
Yep.
So there's a little piece of data. Driving along, all these cars, and there's a Model T Ford.
And you don't assume that you're in 1920?
And I don't assume in 1920. And then 5 minutes later, along comes another Model T Ford. So, bing, right away, my my conditional probability has shifted. Now I'm saying hypothesis. I bet there's an antique car show in town.
Yeah.
Right? Because 2 Model T Ford cars driving by in 5 minutes is a very unusual event. Here comes the third. Now I'm certain. Where's the antique car fair?
What about my explanation?
Well, no, I think
You're
that's
in
good.
1920.
But my point is that this
space-time warp.
approach, where each time I acquire a new piece of data, changes my opinion radically and sometimes profoundly,
Yep.
without having any a priori hypothesis about effect size or any of this, actually can be a very powerful process. And you can do this in sort of updated real time. And then, by car number 4, you're like, where's the antique car show?
Yep.
You're looking on your phone, where is it? And of course, it's there. You're right. The probability of seeing 4 Model T cars in 15 minutes is infinitesimally small, unless there's an antique car show in town.
And then the way I typically would explain this is, life is full of rare events that we don't assume have some nefarious reason for them. People get struck by lightning twice. People win the lottery twice. And
Golfers, for example.
Golfers do. And we don't necessarily assume that the person who got hit by lightning or won the lottery twice necessarily was cheating, because we know that life is full of really rare events. It's only when you have a competing hypothesis that the data fit better under that you then change your mind to believe it. In your case, it's that this seeing 2 Model T Fords is incredibly rare, and therefore there must be some other explanation for it other than I'm in 1920.
Time portals.
Yeah.
I think the converse of that of this issue is also interesting to talk about, in that sometimes studies are overpowered. Sometimes you have such a huge sample size that you are able to show a difference between the two groups that is statistically significant, but because you have so much power, the difference itself is so small that it is almost meaningless. It's clinically insignificant. So I think that you've got problems on both ends.
When you have massive amounts of data, you can find
lots of stuff.
Everything is different.
significant.
There's always differences between whatever it is and whatever it is to some tiny degree. And if you have massive amounts of data, you're right. You're going to find that with statistical significance. I would say there's an even bigger problem with large amounts of data, which is you can find statistical significance because you have massive amounts of data. You can find things that are meaningfully different, and you can be very, very confident in it because you have that very, very lot of data, that precision. But you have bias. And so if you have bias with large amounts of data, you can be overly confident that you have found something
and
that
eliminated
is wrong.
the bias.
Because sample size has no effect on bias.
The more bigger your sample size is, the smaller your what we refer to as random error, the chances that you got it wrong, just due to the probabilities in life. But it does nothing about the systematic error, the confounding, the selection bias, the mismeasurement of variables. And so I think you got to be careful on both ends. I do agree with you, Don.
And it does sort of tend to feed into this sort of assumption that sample size cures all problems in epidemiology.
Absolutely.
Which is, it cures
a real
a problem.
pitfall. That's a real pitfall.
Random error, but it does not deal with systematic error. Yeah.
Yep.
So I don't know. It's a fantastic question. I don't think there's I think what I would take is sort of the meta interpretation of all of this is that no matter what the sample size, no matter what the study design, no matter randomized observation, whatever, you cannot step away from your responsibility to apply common sense.
I would agree with you. I agree with that completely. I wonder if, though, I'm going to be more trusting, not trusting, but more trusting of a bigger study than a small study. In other words, if I have a study of 20 people, immediately my red flags go up. A study of 200 people, not necessarily. A study of 1,000, less so. 10 million. Again, taking into account all the issues about bias, I'm not going to shirk my responsibility to think about those things. But from just, once I start seeing 20 people in a study, I'm going to start thinking, not sure what I can do with this. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's leave it there, and we will move on to our last and presumably our favorite segment. That is our amazing and amusing segment, where we want to highlight some of the things that just make our lives that much better. So the weird, wacky stuff that inspires us. And Don, we know you always have the weirdest and the wackiness. So
this one actually isn't so weird and wacky.
Okay.
But this is actually a study that has massive statistical power because it's 40 individuals. It's double the last study.
How did they get them all?
100% bigger.
100% bigger. That's right. So absolutely to be believed. But this is actually an appropriate study to follow on the hockey study that we just talked about. And what these researchers, it's Brian Wansik and Matthew Cheney, and it was a letter in, I don't know where it was published.
Some journal.
Super Bowls.
That's the name of the journal?
semicolon, serving bowl size and food consumption. So what they did is they identified 40 individuals and they invited them to a Super Bowl party. They set up a table in the adjoining room and they had snacks, energy dense snacks on the table, but it was put into two separate categories. In one category, the snacks were put in a large bowl, an 8-liter bowl, and the other side of the table, the same snacks were put in several smaller bowls. And as the people came into the party, they were alternated to take their snacks from one side or the other. And they all put their snacks using a standardized cup, and they spooned it onto a standardized small plate. They then let them sit there, watch the Super Bowl, eating their snacks. And as soon as they were finished eating their snacks, the researchers collected all the plates. And they counted the number of calories consumed by those individuals by knowing how much was there ahead of time because they weighed the plates, and then subtracting what was left over and determining what the caloric intake was in these two groups. And lo and behold, they found that people who pulled the snacks from the large bowl ate 30% more calories than people who pulled the snacks from the small bowl.
And
So for your next Super Bowl party, if you are concerned about the
big
BMI
bowls.
of your friends and family, put your snacks out in a bunch of tiny bowls.
And so what do you think's going on there? That people look at a small bowl and they feel guilty about taking too much food?
It's a social cue. It's an
like, don't take too
environmental
much.
cue. Yeah, don't eat too much. But it was quite consistent. It was consistent in terms of body size and consistent in terms of gender. Not that they had a whole lot of power to analyze those things.
I feel like I could redo this study, though, with my kids, and it would have no effect. No effect whatsoever. They will eat all of the
You should try it.
all of the hot dogs.
Because
the
they're
mini
not
hot
susceptible
dogs.
to the social cues. do you
They're
think?
not susceptible
They
to
haven't
social
been
cues.
primed yet?
Yeah, no. When it comes to those bacon, those pigs in a blanket
Oh, they're
things,
so good.
they eat them all.
Oh, yeah, so do
before
I.
even
I love those things.
Before I even get into the room, they're
yeah.
gone.
Yeah.
And I don't think it matters what size bowl they're in.
Yeah. Pigs in the
Wow.
blanket.
Okay.
Anyway.
Hole in the toad is all
Don't-
good.
Let's not go all UK on us. All right. Well, that one,
Boiled babies.
I can believe it. I can definitely believe that one. What did you just say?
Boiled baby.
No, don't even start.
It's a
Don't.
delicacy.
Stop.
Chris, what do you got for
All right,
us?
all right. Well,
is it bat related? Is it slime related? What is it?
Slime related.
Slime.
Actually, slime molds.
I can predict.
Slime molds.
There's a motif going on here.
I think we all have.
Fascinating.
We all have our sweet spot. So we all have our wheelhouse.
Now, that would be a savory spot.
Yeah, good point.
Who would know?
We're talking about the slime or the
Cheese,
Super
right?
Bowl.
Have
We
you
all like
tried
fungus.
them?
Ew.
That's a delicate. That's a
Ew.
very,
I think we all,
Savory
we all
slime
have
mold
tried
together.
Slime
tried
mold.
slime mold. Isn't it in hamburger?
So
Slime mold?
when I was a child
I've had
growing
Jello
up,
mold.
when I was a child growing up,
Oh, boy.
I had a morbid fascination for things that would bite and sting and envenomate you and eat you.
But you have,
Venomate.
but you have arachnophobia.
Yeah,
You have
for example,
legendary arachnophobia.
Terrified of spiders, absolutely terrified. And so, later on, I realized that I could put this set of anxiety, this sort of complex anxiety disorder, to profitable use, and became an infectious disease specialist. Who knew you could get paid for knowing about ghoulish things?
Know your enemy.
Know your enemy. Anyway, so I one of the things I love about infectious disease is the immunology of infectious diseases, and one of the things I'm most interested in immunology is macrophages. We've talked about them a couple episodes ago.
Macrophages are those things that eat up the
White blood cells.
Right.
the diseases.
Right. No. The interesting
pathogens.
thing about macrophages is that macrophage-like critters are very common in the environment. Amoebas, for example, and so they are very similar in many ways to macrophages, except that they're free living, and so I'm curious about the behavior of single cell animals like free living amoebas.
Are they animals?
They're not plants.
They're not plants.
Okay, just checking.
They don't photosynthesize, so I guess they are
Send your-
animals. And
send your
they're
corrections to
motile.
at
so
ID Doc
I'm going to say they're
Gill.
animals. They're single-celled animals. But the
Can
interesting
you
about
can you have them as pets?
you could.
There you go. Then they're animals.
All you need is some wadded up wet paper towels,
Yes.
and they'll be very happy.
Pretty boring pet.
Boring pets in there.
Well-
they're very hard to train.
They don't do tricks, but they do move.
You don't need a pet sitter.
They move.
true.
Now, the The free living amoebas
Oh, God.
are like the sort of the soil living scavengers that crawl around and eat bacteria. So they're doing very much what macrophages do, which is go and find bacteria and eat them. Now, when their food source becomes scarce, this is where it gets really interesting, is that the free living amoebas release chemical signals to attract each other, and they form a mass, and they become a multicellular animal.
Like what was that
Like the
cartoon?
Like
The blob.
It's like the blob, because again, this is Halloween themed, right? So we're thinking about
Or like one
movies.
of those not Transformers. What were they? That they all came together and they made one giant Transformer.
Like a giant Kim Jong-un robot.
Oh, please.
Not exactly where I was going with that, but
I don't think that follows.
Sure. If that helps you,
Very
go for
similar. When the food source gets low, they turn into a giant killer robot. So the macrophages, I assume the amoebas, come together
Yeah.
and form what's called a slime mold, which is this big ball.
Technical term.
And here we have some pictures of slime molds.
We can't
which
do pictures on the radio.
Our radio listeners can't see, but there's one that looks like cotton candy, except it's yellow. It actually
need
looks
it.
like those Peeps. It looks a lot like
Oh, it
Peeps.
does.
It
It
really
does.
looks like
Look at
Peeps.
There is the reason never to eat Peeps.
And this one's got
So
the
this should
the
be our
charming
Easter
name,
themed show.
the dog vomit slime mold.
Oh, gross.
That's what it's called.
Lovely.
That's what it's called.
That's what it's called?
That's what it's called. It's that particular
nasty.
species. And they move around. They're at like 1.35 millimeters per second. So they're quite speedy as
1.35 millimeters per second.
That is fast for a blob that's moving around. And as
That was my half marathon time.
they lose food, they start, and then they acquire the ability to detect food scents, and so the slime mold multicellular organism is better able to find its food, and so it's an example of collectivism. Now it gets really interesting.
Oh, you're one of
when
those.
it
Listen to
starts-
this. I've heard about this. This
You're
is
one of
really
those
interesting.
really cool.
socialists, huh?
When the water starts to dry up and like they're going to die because they have to be wet because they're slime molds, they have to be wet.
Believe me, I know.
They adopt an altruistic behavior and they form a fruiting body where they all climb together and they form like a tower, where all the amoebas at the bottom turn rigid, desiccate, and die, but create a rigid structure like a tube with the living amoebas at the top, which then turn into spore-generating animals.
Like
which
the Tower of Sauron.
it's like the Tower of Sauron, right?
I don't know what that is. What's the
Right.
Tower of Sauron?
It's where Sauron's tower. It's his tower. Sauron was a
explain it to
guy
me
from the
later.
Wizard of Oz. No.
Lord of the Rings.
Oh yeah. That's what I meant.
Couldn't be more off.
Follow the yellow brick elf.
Flying orcs. That kind
Right,
of thing.
follow the yellow dog vomit.
Anyway, it's sort of amazing that this multicellular, these free living animals become multicellular, mutualistic, and then they become altruistic animals and sporulate into the environment. I just think it's so cool.
That's not what I had
so
heard.
cool.
I had heard that they have been able to actually detect memory.
Really?
In slime molds.
Memory.
They've been able to put them in a maze with some sort of an attractant, and they
will find their way.
They will find their way, and they will remember the
Slime
ways that
mold.
don't work. Wow. Yeah.
So slime molds, not to be underestimated.
Wow.
And did you know that you can cut them into multiple pieces and they will re-aggregate, just like the blob?
Just like the blob.
So cool. So cool.
Wow.
Happy Halloween.
Okay, slime, whatever from Chris. All right, so mine's a short one, but it does also get to some of my greatest fears. So as I've said on this podcast many
It's like
times,
podcast therapy
this
here.
is podcast therapy for me. So I have all these.
We're not talking about abstracts now.
Okay, so would you guys say you're rule followers or rule breakers?
No.
Answers the question right there. Okay, I'm a rule follower, I would say, generally speaking, in my life. And I like to, I worry about, what's going to happen when I don't follow the rules. And so we in our professional lives have to go out and raise money through writing grants. We have to submit these grant applications. How often do you read the instructions for the grant application you're submitting?
Practically never.
You don't read it.
Hardly ever.
You just write the grant and you
Right.
just, submit it.
Right.
And so those rules that say it's got to be exactly this many pages.
Oh no. Those rules I follow.
How closely do you follow? How
Well, I measure the size of the margin. I
Yeah.
measure the font size. I
Yeah.
do all that stuff.
Yeah,
you
but that's
measure the
only
font
thing.
size?
It sounds like I'm going to be trapped here.
No, I was just one of the ones that I don't probably pay enough attention to is font. So this was an article from Nature News from 2015, October 29, 2015. The headline is "Grant Application Rejected Over Choice of Font." this is the fear of mine. So this is a article about a researcher. I won't get into the name, but someone who's a paleontologist at Imperial College London announced on social media that her fellowship application had been thrown out for being in the wrong font.
Wingdings.
What?
Wingding font.
What's a wingding font?
Oh, you don't know the wingding font?
No, there's such a thing as a wingding.
Oh, absolutely. In Word. Oh, it's awesome.
It's little boxes and squigglies.
It's like little symbols, little faces.
This wasn't
and squiggles.
wingding. This was Calibri.
Oh, really?
Rejected for using Calibri, she
That's
tweeted.
just like Helvetica.
No, you got to use Times New Roman.
What?
Got to use Times New Roman.
You're not an Arial guy?
I like Arial
No,
and Helvetica.
no.
Wow.
You can fit more
Okay.
in with Times New Roman.
That's true.
Well, apparently you could fit way too much in with Calibri, and that was the reason it was rejected. So this was from the UK's Natural Environmental Research Council, and they say it regularly rejects a small number of applications for using the wrong font, and apparently that percentage is 4%. 4% of applications rejected from this particular body for using the wrong font. And I always see that they say there's a particular font you should use, and I don't pay enough attention to that.
What about
And my problem is
your
I'm a
last grant was was in Calibri?
I have no idea, but I'm panicked now, and this is my worst nightmare that is going to come back, and I'm going to tell you guys that my grant got rejected because it was just too good, when the real reason is
Right.
it got rejected because I used the
Improper
wrong font or my margins were too big. So there you go. So all I can say is unlike what I thought, where you could get away with these small infractions, apparently you cannot. Listen to you guys.
Font police. Wow.
The font police are out there.
Christopher Gill likes CG Omega as his font of
What's
choice.
a CG Omega?
I have
font.
no idea.
That's a real font?
It's a real
Did you
font.
invent it? Is
Are
that
you
why it
a-
has your initials
No,
on
that's
it?
what I use for my resume.
I met someone at a party who makes
do.
fonts.
Yeah, I've
That was
yeah,
fantastic. It was a fascinating conversation.
really interesting, huh?
Yeah, really cool.
What do they do for fun?
I assume make wacky fonts. I don't know. I have no idea.
Collect straws, drinking straws? Different kinds of drinking straws?
I heard we were banning straws. Anyway, that is the end of our program.
Thank
If
goodness.
you've got any feedback on this or any other episode you want to suggest a topic for us to take on,
Positive feedback only.
you can tweet us at PopHealthyX or tweet me at ProfMattFox or Chris at IDDocGill. Don's still down for
Yep.
harassing various people. Or you can
I
find
got
us
blocked.
at the Population Health Exchange website. It's www.pophealthyx.org. We want to thank Leslie Talalian, Director of Lifelong Learning at BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound and editing. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you download our next episode.